The air on Eos Minor was a death sentence. Poisoned by centuries of unrelenting storms, it crept into every crevice, every breath, and choked the life from those foolish enough to linger unprotected. Yet here lay Virella, sprawled across jagged obsidian rock, her dark form nearly indistinguishable from the shadows. Her breath was shallow, each exhale misting briefly in the cold, before vanishing into the toxic night. She had once ruled this barren moon with quiet ferocity, the predator at the top of a forgotten ecosystem. The craggy cliffs and acid pools had been her hunting grounds, her dominion. But now, blood seeped from her side, a stark, luminous crimson against the lifeless black rock. Each drop pulsed faintly before the poisonous soil consumed it. Her fingers twitched, clawed tips scraping feebly against the ground. The injury had been unexpected. How long had it been since anything on this moon had posed a true threat to her? She felt the weight of her own carelessness, a rare crack in her armor, and the realization bit deeper than the wound itself. Above, the sky churned with muted lightning. Thick, sulfuric clouds veiled the heavens, allowing only the faintest hints of starlight to break through. The sound of the storms was ever present, a low, mournful groan that resonated deep within the bones. It was a sound she had grown numb to over the centuries. Now, it seemed to mock her. Her eyes fluttered shut, their otherworldly iridescence dimming. This, she thought, would be the end. Not with a triumphant clash, but alone, unobserved, swallowed by the same desolation she had mastered for so long. But then a sound. At first it was distant, barely more than a whisper against the wind, a steady, rhythmic pulse, like the heartbeat of something alien. It grew louder, accompanied by faint vibrations that tickled the edge of her awareness. Footsteps. Her eyes snapped open, pupils narrowing into razor-thin slits. The effort sent a searing jolt through her side, but her instincts overrode the pain. She was no longer alone. The light appeared next, a pale beam slicing through the storm-choked darkness. It swept across the ground methodically, its source still hidden by the jagged rocks and ridges. Virella tensed, every ounce of her remaining strength coiled like a spring. The figure emerged moments later, a humanoid shape clad in a pressurized suit, its surface battered and scorched from the elements. The figure moved with deliberate caution, scanning the terrain with a handheld device. The beam of light emanating from their helmet swept closer, glinting off the luminous trail of blood she had unwittingly left behind. Panic rose, an unfamiliar sensation that clawed at her mind. She was too weak to fight, too exposed to flee. And this figure, this human, was no mere scavenger. Their movements betrayed purpose, their tools, sophistication. They weren't here by chance. The figure knelt beside her, the light falling fully onto her form. She flinched, her instincts screaming to lash out, but her body betrayed her, refusing to obey. She heard a sharp intake of breath filtered through the helmet's speakers. "Survivor," the voice murmured. "Male," she noted distantly, though the tone carried a weight she couldn't quite place. "You're alive." The human's gloved hand hesitated before reaching toward her, brushing lightly against her arm. She stiffened, expecting the usual reaction, revulsion, fear, retreat, but none came. Instead, the man shifted closer, his other hand quickly working to retrieve something from his pack. Virella's vision blurred, her strength ebbing with every passing second. She was acutely aware of her vulnerability, of how easily this human could end her now if he only knew what she was. Yet, inexplicably, he seemed intent on saving her. Through the haze, she caught fragments of his voice as he worked. "Bad shape. Bleeding out." The words felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else's reality. She wanted to speak, to warn him away, but the effort was monumental. Instead, her head lolled to the side, and she watched through heavy lids as he applied a field dressing to her wound with surprising precision. The absurdity of the situation struck her in fleeting clarity. A human, a creature she had once viewed as nothing more than prey, was risking his life for hers. On this moon, where survival was measured in breaths and seconds, such an act bordered on madness. As consciousness began to slip, A single thought anchored her. Why? The human adjusted something on his wrist, and she felt a slight shift in the air pressure around her. He was sealing them inside an artificial bubble of breathable atmosphere. "Stay with me," he urged, his voice firmer now, cutting through the fog of her mind. "I've got you." The darkness at the edges of her vision swirled closer, threatening to consume her completely. Yet the man's presence, his determination, acted as a fragile tether. Against all reason, she clung to it. In the distance, the storm howled louder, the toxic winds carrying with them the promise of greater dangers to come. For the first time in centuries, Varela felt something unfamiliar, a sliver of hope, tangled with dread. And as the human lifted her carefully, cradling her broken form against his armored chest, she allowed herself to succumb to the darkness, knowing that, for better or worse, her fate was no longer her own. When Varela awoke, the air tasted sterile. It lacked the toxic sharpness she had grown accustomed to, the acrid tang that clawed at the throat with each breath. Instead, it was unnaturally clean, filtered, and devoid of character. The sensation was unnerving. She lay on a cot, in a small, dimly lit chamber, the ceiling above her low and ridged with metallic struts. Her sharp senses, dulled only hours ago, slowly returned, unfurling like the limbs of a resting predator. She could hear the faint hum of machinery, the rhythmic clicks of systems cycling, and the distant murmur of voices just beyond the sealed hatch. The space smelled of human habitation, sweat faintly masked by antiseptic, the oily tang of machinery, and something richer, a hint of stale food perhaps. The environment was alien to her, and yet, for the first time in centuries, she felt neither the oppressive weight of the moon's storms nor the imminent threat of another predator's strike. She shifted on the cot, her side pulsing with a dull ache. The human. Ethan. She had gleaned his name from the muffled fragments of conversation she caught before succumbing to unconsciousness, had tended to her wound with a meticulousness that belied his rugged demeanor. A bandage wrapped tightly around her torso, laced with an unfamiliar synthetic material that her body seemed not to reject. Rising slowly, she swung her legs over the edge of the cot, her bare feet brushing against the cold, grated floor. The chamber was small, clearly functional rather than comfortable. Against the far wall stood a metal cabinet with neatly organized supplies, its contents glowing faintly in the sterile white light. A portable air filtration unit hummed in the corner, and next to it, a sealed container filled with pale liquid she recognized as water. Her gaze sharpened as she studied the hatch. Beyond it, she could make out voices, low and purposeful, occasionally punctuated by the faint clatter of equipment. Varela tilted her head, focusing. "Wasn't even supposed to be here this long," one voice muttered, rough-edged and weary. "HQ doesn't care about delays. They just want results." A second voice responded, lighter, but carrying an edge of frustration. "Results? We've barely scraped the surface out there, and now he's brought her back." Her. Varela's senses prickled. The voice carried an unmistakable wariness, mingled with distrust. The humans knew she was different, though they seemed not to grasp the full extent of her otherness. Yet. The hatch hissed softly as it slid open, and Ethan stepped inside. His presence filled the small room with an air of controlled energy, his movements purposeful but unhurried. He wore a simple patched flight suit, streaked with soot and grime, his utility belt clinking faintly with tools as he walked. "You're awake," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. He paused a few feet away, studying her with a gaze that was both curious and calculating. Varela didn't respond immediately. Her eyes flicked to the equipment at his waist, noting the compact blade holstered beside a small plasma tool. Dangerous tools for someone far more fragile than she. Ethan sighed, his posture softening. "You're lucky we found you when we did. Out there." He gestured vaguely toward the chamber's bulkhead. "Nothing lasts long out there." "Why?" she asked finally, her voice dry and low. The question seemed to catch him off guard, though he quickly masked it. Why what? Why save me? Ethan frowned, leaning against the wall. I don't leave people behind. That's not who I am. He hesitated, then added, though I'll admit you're not exactly what I expected. Varela held his gaze, searching for cracks in his sincerity. She found none, but his answer only deepened her unease. Humans were driven by motives: survival, gain, fear. Altruism was rare, particularly in a place as hostile as this. Before she could press further, the hatch slid open again, and another human stepped in. A woman, younger than Ethan, with sharp features framed by a cascade of chestnut hair pulled into a tight braid. She wore a similar flight suit, though hers bore fewer marks of wear. Her expression was guarded, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. You're moving already? The woman said, her voice carrying a faint edge. That's impressive. Ethan glanced at her, then back at Varela. This is Corporal Sienna Grant, he said, his tone light but edged with unspoken warning. She's part of my team. Grant's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied Varela. What were you doing out there? She asked bluntly. That terrain is death for most people, even with gear. Varela met her gaze steadily. I survived. That much is obvious, Grant shot back, her tone biting. But how? Ethan stepped between them, cutting off the growing tension. That's enough, Sienna. She's recovering. We'll get to questions later. Grant's lips tightened, but she stepped back, glancing once more at Varela before exiting the room. When the hatch closed, Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. She's thorough, he said apologetically. Doesn't trust easy. Neither do I, Varela murmured, more to herself than to him. Ethan's eyes softened briefly, though he quickly masked it. We've got a base set up here. Temporary, but functional. The storms make it impossible to transmit far, so we're on our own for now. Whatever brought you here, you're stuck with us for the time being. She didn't reply, but her mind churned. The humans had carved out a fragile refuge in the heart of a dying world. Their motives, their purpose here, remained shrouded. Yet there was a weight to Ethan's words, a subtle hint of desperation that suggested their time was running out. And though she couldn't yet see the larger picture, Varela knew one thing for certain. These humans were more than they appeared, and so was she. The quiet didn't last. Varela paced the confines of the cramped chamber like a caged predator. Each step sent faint ripples of pain through her wounded side, but the discomfort was manageable. The sealed bandages Ethan had applied were efficient, and her body, even in its weakened state, was already knitting itself back together. Yet the deeper wounds, her pride, her unease, festered. This place, this human refuge, was too clean, too quiet. It grated against instincts honed over centuries of survival in the wild. She belonged to the chaos outside, where storms raged and blood spilled freely. Here, she was vulnerable in a way she hadn't been for centuries. She stopped by the lone viewport, gazing out at the desolate landscape beyond. Eos Minor's surface stretched endlessly, a tableau of lifeless rock bathed in hues of gray and green. The perpetual storm churned overhead, its lightning illuminating the jagged horizon in staccato bursts. Even now, she could sense the pulse of the storm, its energy raw and untamed. But something else prickled at her awareness. A subtle shift in the air, a tremor too faint for human senses. Her eyes narrowed, her claws brushing against the edge of her cot. The moon was restless, and she knew better than to ignore its warnings. The faint hum of the chamber door caught her attention. It slid open, and Ethan entered, his movements hurried but not frantic. He carried a device in his hand, its screen flickering with a chaotic array of symbols. Something's wrong, he said without preamble. Varela turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. What is it? Perimeter breach. His voice was tight, measured. The sensors are picking up movement outside. Could be an animal, but it's erratic, too focused. She frowned. Your sensors won't catch everything. The storms interfere. He nodded, his gaze sharp. I know. That's why I need eyes out there. And given how I found you, I figure you've got a better chance out in the storm than most." Varela tilted her head, studying him. "You want me to go outside?" "It's that, or let whatever's out there come to us," Ethan replied. His tone was pragmatic, but there was an undercurrent of unease he couldn't fully mask. She considered the proposition. The idea of returning to the storm sent a flicker of anticipation through her, a longing to feel the raw elements against her skin once more. But her wound was not yet fully healed, and the human's unease suggested the threat was greater than they admitted. Ethan stepped closer, holding out a small device. "Take this. It'll keep you on our frequency, and it's rigged with a directional beacon. If you get lost in the storm, we can track you." Her fingers brushed against his as she took the device, her claws grazing his glove. He didn't flinch, which she noted with mild surprise. "Where should I start?" she asked. "The eastern ridge," he said. "It's where we picked up the breach. Be careful. It's a treacherous climb even without the storm." She gave a curt nod and strode toward the hatch, her movements fluid despite the ache in her side. Ethan stepped aside to let her pass, his expression unreadable. The storm greeted her with its full ferocity as she stepped outside. The wind howled, carrying with it fine particles of acidic dust that stung against her exposed skin. The suit they'd given her provided minimal protection, and she quickly realized it was better suited for their fragile human bodies than hers. Still, she moved with purpose, her senses sharpening as the familiar chaos of the moon enveloped her. The terrain was as unforgiving as she remembered, its jagged rocks slick with condensation and treacherous underfoot. The beacon in her hand flickered, guiding her toward the ridge. As she climbed, her thoughts churned. What could have breached the human's perimeter? The moon's natural predators were formidable, but they rarely ventured this close to any organized resistance. If something was bold enough to approach, it was either desperate or deliberate. She reached the ridge and crouched low, scanning the area. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, dazzling flashes. The human's perimeter lights flickered faintly in the distance, barely visible through the storm's haze. And then she saw it. A shadow moved against the wind, its form lithe and serpentine. It slithered across the rocks with unsettling grace, its movements too fluid, too calculated. Varela's breath hitched as recognition dawned. It wasn't an animal. The figure stopped, its head turning toward her with eerie precision. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and a low, guttural sound rumbled through the storm, a sound she hadn't heard in centuries. One of her own kind. The realization struck like a blow. Her kind rarely left their enclaves, and even then, they never traveled alone. This one was a scout, its presence a harbinger of something far worse. The figure moved closer, its speed startling even for her enhanced senses. She dropped the beacon and leapt backward, narrowly avoiding the strike of a long-bladed appendage that buried itself in the rock where she had stood. The storm screamed around them as they clashed. Varela's claws raked against her attacker's hardened flesh, but the creature was relentless, its strength matched only by its precision. She fought to keep her footing, the ridge's slick surface making every move a gamble. Her wound throbbed, each motion sending a fresh jolt of pain through her body, but she couldn't afford to falter. The creature lunged again and she sidestepped, using the storm's wind to push herself off balance and out of its reach. As it stumbled, she struck, driving her claws into its exposed side. A guttural howl echoed through the storm as the creature collapsed, its form crumpling against the rocks. Varela stepped back, panting, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The storm carried away the remnants of the battle, leaving her alone once more. But she knew this was only the beginning. The scout wasn't the real threat. It was the warning. Something far greater was coming, and the humans, for all their ingenuity, were woefully unprepared. The storm's fury had abated slightly by the time Varela returned to the base, though its distant growls still punctuated the silence. She moved quickly, her body aching from the encounter, but her resolve firm. The lifeless body of the scout weighed heavily in her thoughts. The creature had been a message, a harbinger of something far greater and far deadlier. When she reached the perimeter, Ethan was already waiting. He stood silhouetted against the weak glow of the camp's floodlights, his stance tense, one hand resting on the holstered weapon at his side. The storm's winds whipped at his jacket, but he didn't flinch as she approached. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low but insistent. Varela didn't answer immediately. She stepped past him, into the shelter of the base's outer corridor, her sharp gaze scanning the area. Only when she was certain they were alone did she speak. "There was a breach," she said, her tone measured. "But it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something dangerous." Ethan frowned, following her inside. "Define dangerous." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "It was one of my kind." He blinked, caught off guard. "Your kind? You're saying, what, there are more of you out there?" Varela didn't respond directly. Instead, she reached into the pouch she'd taken from the scout's body and withdrew a small metallic object. It was jagged and dark, its surface etched with intricate, pulsating lines that seemed to hum faintly with an internal energy. "What is that?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with unease. "A marker," Varela replied. Her tone was distant, as if the words carried her somewhere far away. "A sign of the fallen." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Fallen?" She hesitated, her fingers brushing over the marker's surface. The memories it stirred were old and bitter, buried deep but never forgotten. "My kind are not as you see me now," she began slowly. "Once we were unified, bound by purpose. But that unity was fractured long ago. Some of us, those you would call the fallen, turned against the old ways, seeking power through destruction and domination. They were cast out, but they didn't vanish. They've lingered, waiting." "For what?" Ethan pressed. "For this." She held up the marker, its faint glow casting eerie shadows across the walls. "They've found me." Ethan stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "Why would they come after you now?" "Because of what I carry," Varela said, her voice tightening. "The blood that sustains me, it isn't just for survival. It holds something more. Power, memory, legacy. The fallen want it, and they'll stop at nothing to take it." Before Ethan could respond, the base's lights flickered. A low, ominous hum reverberated through the walls, followed by a series of sharp staccato beeps. Ethan's hand went to his weapon. "What the hell?" The comm system crackled to life, Sienna's voice sharp and urgent. "Captain, we've got a problem. Sensors are picking up movement, multiple signals closing fast." Ethan swore under his breath, striding toward the control room. Varela followed, her senses on high alert. When they entered the control room, it was a hive of activity. Sienna stood at the central console, her fingers flying over the controls as the screen displayed a chaotic array of signals converging on their location. "What's out there?" Ethan demanded. "Unknown," Sienna replied, her tone clipped. "Could be wildlife, but the patterns are too coordinated. Whatever it is, it's big, and it's coming straight for us." Varela stepped closer to the screen, her sharp eyes narrowing as she studied the signals. "It's them," she said quietly. "The fallen." Sienna shot her a sharp look. "The what now?" "There's no time to explain," Varela said, her voice firm. "You need to fortify the base. Whatever defenses you have, activate them now." Ethan nodded, his voice steady despite the tension in his eyes. "Sienna, get the perimeter defenses online. I want every turret and shield at full capacity." Sienna hesitated, her gaze flicking between Ethan and Varela. "Are we seriously trusting her judgment?" Ethan met her gaze, his expression unyielding. "Right now we don't have a choice. Do it." Sienna muttered something under her breath but complied, her hands moving swiftly over the controls. As the alarms blared and the base shifted into lockdown mode, Varela felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. The Fallen were coming, and with them, the storm would only grow. But it wasn't until the first impact reverberated through the walls that she realized just how high the stakes had become. The Fallen weren't here to take her blood. They were here to destroy everything in their path, and anyone foolish enough to stand in their way. The walls of the base trembled as another deafening impact reverberated through the structure. Lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the room, while the sound of distant machinery powering up filled the air. Varela stood motionless near the viewport, her gaze fixed on the storm outside, where flickers of movement hinted at the advancing forces. The Fallen had come. Ethan moved purposefully across the room, issuing orders into his comms. His voice, firm and unyielding, cut through the chaos. Sector 2 turrets, redirect to the south. Sienna, patch the western defense grid through to my console. If they get through the perimeter, we won't hold them. Behind him, Sienna worked furiously, her fingers a blur across the control console. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her usual confidence replaced with grim determination. They're testing the shields, Sienna said, her voice tight. The pulses are synchronized. This isn't random. Varela finally turned from the viewport. Of course it's not random. They're calculating your weaknesses. Sienna shot her a glare but didn't respond. Ethan stepped closer to Varela, his expression hard. How do we stop them? You don't, she said bluntly. Not if they've brought a full strike force. The Fallen don't retreat. They consume. Her words hung in the air like a weight. There has to be something we can do, Ethan insisted. Varela studied him for a moment, noting the resolve in his eyes. It was a trait she had seen countless times before, in prey that refused to surrender, even when death was certain. But this was different. Ethan's determination wasn't born of desperation. It was rooted in something deeper. They're not here for your base, she said after a long pause. They're here for me. Sienna stopped typing and turned to face her. Excuse me? They tracked me here, Varela continued, her tone matter-of-fact. I carry something they want, something they've hunted for centuries. If I leave, they'll follow. Ethan's jaw tightened. You think abandoning us will solve this? What stops them from coming back after they've taken you? Varela's gaze was steady. You underestimate how single-minded the Fallen are. To them, I am the prize. You're collateral damage. The room fell silent, except for the distant hum of the base's systems. Sienna looked between Ethan and Varela, her expression incredulous. You're seriously considering letting her just waltz out there? Do you know what they'll do to her? Varela smirked faintly. Spare me your concern, human. I've faced worse than the Fallen. Ethan folded his arms, his voice sharp. We're not sending you out there alone. If they want you that badly, they'll bring everything they've got. You won't survive. Survival isn't the point, Varela replied. Her tone was cool, but there was a flicker of something else beneath it, an edge of vulnerability she hadn't meant to show. Ethan shook his head. There has to be another way. Before anyone could respond, the room was rocked by a powerful explosion. Sparks rained down from the ceiling, and the base's emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the room in a dim red glow. They've breached the outer wall, Sienna said, her voice trembling. We're running out of time. Varela turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. You said you wouldn't survive out there without me. That's still true, isn't it? He hesitated, then nodded. The storm, the terrain, they'd tear us apart. Then let me buy you time, she said. Ethan's eyes narrowed. You're not a sacrificial lamb. And you're not my keeper, she shot back. You have a choice, human. Fight a battle you can't win, or let me do what I do best. Before he could argue further, an alarm blared, and Sienna's voice cut through the chaos. They're inside, Ethan cursed under his breath, drawing his weapon. Sienna, seal off the lower levels. I want a fallback route ready. Sienna nodded, her hands moving rapidly over the console. Varela stepped forward, her gaze locking onto Ethan's. If you want to live, you'll trust me. Otherwise, you're all dead. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then, with a reluctant nod, he gestured toward the exit. "You get one shot at this, don't make me regret it." Varela smirked, the faintest hint of her predatory nature returning. "You won't." She turned and strode toward the hatch, her movements fluid despite the weight of the moment. As she stepped into the corridor, the sounds of battle grew louder, metallic screeches, the thrum of energy weapons, and the distant roar of the storm outside. She inhaled deeply, letting the chaos wash over her. This was her element. But as she moved toward the breach, a new thought crept into her mind, a question she hadn't allowed herself to ask before. Why had Ethan saved her in the first place? And more importantly, why did she care? The thought unsettled her, but she pushed it aside. There would be time for answers later, if she survived. For now, she had a war to fight. The air outside was thick with acrid smoke and static energy, the storm's fury merging with the chaos of the fallen's siege. The desolation of the moon's landscape was barely visible through the rippling distortion of the protective shields, now faltering under relentless bombardment. Varela stepped through the breached corridor into the open night, her senses heightened, her body humming with the energy of the blood coursing through her veins. Behind her, Ethan's voice crackled in her calm. "You've got their attention. Be careful." A bitter smile touched her lips. Care isn't what they'll expect. She could feel them now, the fallen. They were close, their presence radiating like a cold, suffocating wave. They moved as a single organism, their whispers slipping through the air, reaching for her mind, tugging at old buried instincts. Varela, the betrayer, the lost, the forsaken. The voices were familiar, an echo of a past she had severed. Her grip tightened around the jagged marker in her hand, its pulsing energy a tether to the moment, anchoring her against the tide of memories. "Come then," she murmured, her voice low but carrying. "Face me." The ground trembled as the first of them emerged from the storm. Tall, sinewy figures wrapped in shifting, dark armor, their forms flickering like shadows torn between dimensions. They moved with a fluid grace, their weapons extensions of their bodies, humming with lethal intent. Varela's breath slowed, her predator's instinct sharpening. She felt the pull of the blood within her, the ancient power demanding to be unleashed. But to tap into it fully meant surrendering to what she was, a choice she had resisted for centuries. The fallen leader stepped forward, its form taller and more defined than the others, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. Its voice was a rasping hiss, both alien and intimate. "You cannot hide what you are, Varela. The blood calls to us. Give it willingly, and we may grant you mercy." Varela laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Mercy? From the likes of you? Spare me your lies." The leader tilted its head, as if amused. "You've grown weak among the humans, forgotten what it means to be one of us, but the blood remembers, and soon it will be ours." The others moved to surround her, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. "Not today," she said softly. With a sudden burst of speed, Varela launched herself at the nearest figure. Her movements were a blur, faster than human eyes could track. Her claws slashed through armor and flesh, her strength fueled by the blood's power. The fallen staggered, hissing in pain, but others quickly closed in, their strikes coordinated and deadly. She fought with ferocity, but the numbers were overwhelming. For every fallen she struck down, two more took its place. Their blades grazed her skin, their energy burned, searing her flesh. Inside the base, Ethan watched the battle unfold through the grainy feed of a surveillance drone. His fists clenched as he saw her falter, the relentless onslaught taking its toll. "She can't hold them off forever," Sienna said, her voice tense. Ethan's jaw tightened. "We're not leaving her out there alone." "She told us to stay put," Sienna argued. "You run out there, and you'll get yourself killed." Ethan didn't respond. He grabbed his rifle and moved toward the exit. "Ethan!" Sienna shouted after him, but he was already gone. Outside, Varela fell to one knee, blood dripping from countless wounds. The leader of the fallen approached her, its movement slow and deliberate. "It's over," it said, its voice triumphant. You fought well, but you were always meant to fall. Varela raised her head, her eyes blazing with defiance. I'm not done yet. The marker in her hand flared to life, its energy surging through her. She screamed as the power consumed her, her body transforming, her form becoming more monstrous and unearthly. The fallen hesitated, their collective whispers faltering. What have you done? The leader demanded. Varela rose, her voice a guttural growl. I've remembered. With a roar, she unleashed the full force of the blood's power. The ground shook as tendrils of dark energy erupted from her, tearing through the fallen ranks. Their screams echoed across the landscape, their forms disintegrating under the onslaught. But the power was uncontrollable, its reach extending far beyond the battlefield. The base trembled, its shields faltering further as the storm intensified. Ethan reached her just as the last of the fallen fell. He skidded to a halt, staring at her in shock. Varela, he said, his voice barely audible over the chaos. She turned to him, her monstrous form flickering, her eyes filled with both pain and fury. I can't stop it, she said, her voice distorted. The power, it's too much. He stepped closer, ignoring the danger. You can. You're stronger than this. You saved us, you saved me. Don't let it take you now. Her gaze softened, the human part of her struggling to resurface. But the energy continued to surge, threatening to consume everything. Then run, she said, her voice breaking, before it's too late. Ethan shook his head. Not without you. He reached out, his hand finding hers. The touch was grounding, a lifeline in the chaos. Slowly, the energy began to recede, the storm easing as the blood's power calmed. Varela collapsed into his arms, her monstrous form fading. The battlefield was silent, the storm reduced to a distant murmur. You're an idiot, she whispered weakly. Ethan smiled faintly. Yeah, well, you're welcome. For a moment there was peace, but in the back of Varela's mind, she knew this was only the beginning. The blood's power was still within her, and the fallen's defeat would not go unnoticed. Their fight was far from over. The air was still, a silence so profound it seemed to stretch into the very bones of the land. Where the battle had raged only hours before, the ground was littered with the remains of the fallen, their once fluid forms now nothing more than brittle, crystallized fragments. The storm that had encased the moon for as long as Varela could remember had subsided, revealing a jagged, desolate horizon beneath the faint glow of a distant sun. Varela stood at the edge of the base's outer wall, her body bruised and battered, her thoughts heavy. She watched as Ethan approached, his gait slow but purposeful, the faint limp in his step a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. You should be resting, he said as he reached her, his voice tinged with both concern and exhaustion. She didn't look at him immediately, her eyes fixed on the far-off expanse. Resting feels like surrender. Ethan leaned against the wall beside her, his rifle slung over his shoulder. You've earned it, we all have. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It carried the weight of what they had endured and the unspoken understanding of what was left. Finally, Varela broke the silence. I didn't think I'd survive this. Not just the battle. This connection. Ethan glanced at her, his expression softening. Connection? Her lips curved into a faint, wry smile. Don't make me say it twice, human. Ethan chuckled, the sound dry but genuine. Fair enough. Varela turned to face him, her gaze steady. I've spent centuries surviving, Ethan, living by instinct, by hunger. That's all I was. And then you... She hesitated, her voice faltering. You changed that. He didn't respond immediately, letting her words linger. When he finally spoke, his tone was quiet but firm. You changed yourself, Varela. I just gave you a reason to. She looked away, the vulnerability in her eyes quickly masked. And what happens now? What reason do I have to stay, knowing what I am? Ethan reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. What you are isn't the question. It's what you want to be. The weight of his words settled over her like a mantle, and for the first time in centuries, she allowed herself to consider the possibility of something beyond survival. Behind them, the base was a hive of activity. Survivors worked tirelessly to repair the damage, their movements driven by the shared knowledge that this reprieve was temporary. Sienna emerged from the command center, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "There you are," she said as she approached. "I've been running scans on the perimeter. No sign of additional fallen activity, but I wouldn't bet on it staying that way." Ethan nodded. "We need to prepare, reinforce the shields, stockpile supplies." Sienna looked between him and Varela, her gaze lingering on the latter. "And her? What happens if they come back for her?" Varela met Sienna's eyes, her expression inscrutable. "Let them, I'm not running anymore." The declaration hung in the air, and even Sienna, who had been openly skeptical of Varela from the start, seemed to recognize its significance. Ethan's calm crackled to life, a garbled voice coming through. "Hayes, we've got a signal. Unidentified craft entering the system. ETA, 3 hours." The three of them exchanged a glance, the fragile calm already fracturing. "Looks like we don't get much of a break," Ethan said. Varela smirked faintly. "Good. I'd hate to get complacent." Sienna sighed. "I'll coordinate the defenses. Try not to die out there, Hayes." As Sienna walked away, Ethan turned back to Varela. "You could leave, you know. Head somewhere far enough that even they couldn't follow." She shook her head. "Running would mean leaving you to face them alone. That's not who I am anymore." His smile was faint but genuine. "Good to hear." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. The base's defenses were fortified, the survivors readying themselves for the unknown. Varela found herself in the armory, inspecting a blade that had seen better days, but still held an edge. Ethan entered, watching her silently for a moment before speaking. "You know, for someone who claims to have lived centuries, you've got a knack for looking like this is your first rodeo." She arched an eyebrow. "You find humor at the strangest times." "It's a coping mechanism," he admitted. "You should try it." She held the blade up to the light, its surface catching the faint glow of the lamps overhead. "Perhaps I will." As the countdown to the unidentified craft's arrival ticked down, Varela and Ethan stood side by side at the outer perimeter, their weapons at the ready. The storm had begun to return, the wind howling across the barren landscape. "Whatever happens," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the tension in the air, "I'm glad you were here." She glanced at him, her expression softening. "Don't get sentimental on me now, human," he smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." The distant roar of engines grew louder, the craft's silhouette emerging from the storm. Varela tightened her grip on her blade, her senses sharp. This time, she wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting for something more. And for the first time in centuries, she felt alive. The story might have begun with isolation and hunger, but it ended with defiance and connection. Whatever came next, Varela was ready.